I noticed the cake before I noticed the crowd. It was a 3-tier chocolate cake with gold lettering, and my name was written across it in cursive. Marcus, 45 today. My wife had spent 2 weeks planning this surprise birthday party, called every person I'd known for the past decade, and decorated our entire backyard with string lights and white roses. Standing there in the middle of it all, surrounded by my coworkers, my college friends, my own parents, my 16-year-old son Tyler, I remember thinking she had never done anything this elaborate for me before. Not once in 14 years. I should have recognized that for what it was. My wife, I'll call her Sophia, stood at the center of the yard in a red dress she'd bought the previous weekend. She looked radiant. She had that particular brightness in her eyes, the kind I used to think meant she was happy, but that I would later understand meant something else entirely. Her mother, Patricia, stood a few feet to her left, sipping white wine with the particular satisfaction of someone who already knows the ending of a movie. Someone handed me a drink. Tyler hugged me from the side and said, "Happy birthday, Dad," and I put my arm around him and felt genuinely, completely foolish that I hadn't seen any of it coming. The toast started normally. My old college friend said something embarrassing about a road trip we took in our 20s. My mother cried a little. My father shook my hand the way he always did, firm and brief, like affection was something to be administered in small doses. Then Sophia tapped her glass. She said she had something she wanted to share. She said it with a smile, the kind that doesn't quite reach all the way, and the yard went quiet in that particular way. That happens when a room full of people collectively senses something is wrong, but can't yet name it. Patricia refilled her wine. Sophia said she had been doing a lot of thinking over the past year. She said she had realized that she had not been living her truth. She used that phrase, her truth, twice in the first 30 seconds, which told me she had rehearsed this. She said that she and I had grown in different directions and that she believed people had the right to pursue their own joy and that she had recently discovered something about herself that she could no longer keep private. My father put down his fork. Sophia said she was in love with someone else. She said it the way you'd announce a promotion. She said she had been seeing him for 7 months and that she no longer believed in the concept of monogamy as a healthy or natural way to live. She said she wanted an open arrangement or she wanted her freedom entirely, and she felt that today, surrounded by the people who mattered most to both of us, was the right moment to say so out loud. Tyler made a sound beside me that I will never forget. It wasn't quite a word. It was something that came before words. I didn't flip the table. I didn't yell. I stood very still with a glass in my hand and looked at my wife in her red dress and thought about a document that was currently sitting in the top drawer of my home office desk. Signed 14 years ago by both of us. Witnessed by 2 attorneys, fully notarized and entirely binding. I set my glass down on the table, very carefully. I said, "Thank you for telling me, Sophia," and I walked inside. Behind me, I heard Patricia say something to the effect that it takes real courage to speak your truth. I heard my mother say, "Oh my God." I heard Tyler's chair scrape back from the table. I did not hear Sophia say anything at all. I sat in my home office for 40 minutes. I called my attorney. His name was Daniel, and he was the kind of man who kept his phone on at all times and never sounded surprised by anything. I told him what had happened. He said, "All right," and I could hear him already thinking through the calendar. "We have the prenup," I said. "I know," he said. "I'll start the paperwork Monday. Get out of the house tonight if you can." I thanked him and hung up. Then I sat there for another minute, looking at the drawer. I had signed the prenuptial agreement 12 days before our wedding, at the insistence of my father, who had watched his own brother lose everything he'd built to a divorce, and had decided that certain lessons were non-negotiable. Sophia had not been happy about it. Her mother had been furious. Patricia had called me controlling, calculating, unromantic, suspicious. She had a rich vocabulary for a woman being asked to sign a standard legal document. But Sophia had signed it. She'd said it was fine, it was just paper, it didn't mean anything. She trusted me. The prenup specified that in the event of divorce initiated due to documented infidelity, Sophia would receive no claim on the business I had built over the past 11 years. She would receive no portion of the retirement accounts I held individually. She would receive a limited settlement, modest by any fair standard, and no spousal support beyond 18 months. Her attorney had reviewed it. She had initialed every page. I had initialed every page. I had not told Sophia that I still had a copy. She had asked me once, about 4 years into the marriage, whether we could revisit the agreement. I had said we could discuss it. We never discussed it. I spent that night at my parents' house. My mother made coffee and didn't say much, which was the kindest thing she could have done. My father sat across from me at the kitchen table and said, "You don't have to explain anything tonight, son." I told him about the prenup. He nodded once and said, "Good." Tyler called me at 11:30 that night. His voice was flat in the way teenage boys' voices get when they're holding something together by sheer will. He said, "Dad, what's happening?" I said, "I'm not sure of all the details yet, but your mother and I are going to get divorced." He was quiet. Then he said, "Is it because of him?" I said, "You know about him." He said he'd known for about 2 months. He'd seen a text on his mother's phone by accident and hadn't known what to do with the information. He said he was sorry. He said he should have told me. His voice cracked on the last word and he apologized for that too. This kid who had done nothing wrong, apologizing for the thing his mother had done. I told him he had nothing to be sorry for. I told him I loved him. I told him to get some sleep. He said, "Okay, Dad. I love you too." I did not sleep. The next morning, Sophia called me 6 times before 9 o'clock. I didn't answer. She texted me a series of messages that moved rapidly through the emotional spectrum, first explaining that I was overreacting, then accusing me of emotional unavailability, then suggesting that my refusal to discuss things was exactly the kind of behavior that had driven her to this point in the first place. Her mother had apparently gotten involved by message 4 because the tone shifted into something more formal and slightly more threatening. I forwarded everything to Daniel. When I finally went back to the house 2 days later to collect some things, Sophia was there with Patricia. This was not a coincidence. Patricia sat at my kitchen table like she owned the room, which is a skill she had refined over 14 years of practice. Sophia stood by the kitchen island with her arms crossed and said, "We need to talk about this like adults." I said I had already spoken to my attorney and she should do the same. Patricia said, "He's always been like this. Cold. You try to have a real conversation and he shuts down. This is why she looked elsewhere, you know. You never gave her what she needed." I picked up the box I'd come for and said, "Have a good afternoon." Sophia said, "Marcus, I'm not asking for a war. I just want to sit down and work this out fairly." I said, "I agree. That's what attorneys are for." She said, "You're going to make this ugly." I said, "I didn't make anything, Sophia." Patricia started saying something about emotional abuse and patterns of control, and I walked out the front door and got in my car and drove away. The next several weeks were a particular kind of miserable that I don't have a clean word for. The legal process moved at its own pace. Sophia hired an attorney who sent an opening offer that assumed, apparently, that no prenuptial agreement existed. Daniel called me to describe it, and I could hear the particular satisfaction of a man who has been waiting to play a card. He sent our copy of the prenup the following morning. Sophia's attorney took 4 days to respond. When they did, the offer had changed considerably. Meanwhile, Patricia had appointed herself the social media division of Sophia's campaign. She posted things on her personal accounts about marriages that suffocate women, about men who use money as control, about the courage it takes to walk away from something that is slowly killing you. None of it named me directly. All of it was clearly about me. Several of our mutual acquaintances reached out to offer me either sympathy or careful neutrality, which told me where the narrative was landing. I said nothing publicly. Daniel had told me not to. I did not post, comment, or respond to anything. Tyler moved into my new apartment with me 2 weeks after I left the house. He had asked me if he could. He said he didn't want to stay in the house with his grandmother constantly present, and his mother cycling through moods he didn't know how to manage. He said he was sorry if that hurt her. I told him his feelings were valid and he didn't owe anyone a particular living arrangement. Sophia called me about it 4 days later. Her voice had the particular quality it got when she had been coached. She said Tyler's decision was emotionally damaging for him and that I was clearly influencing him against her. I said I had not asked Tyler to come live with me. I said he had made his own decision. She said a 16-year-old doesn't make his own decisions without parental influence. I said, "He's a remarkably self-aware kid, Sophia. You raised him too." She didn't have an answer for that. The silence stretched out for a moment, and I heard something in it. Something less certain than she'd sounded a minute before. Then she said, "I just want this to be civil." I said, "So do I." Call your attorney." She hung up. The hearing arrived on a gray Tuesday in November. Sophia appeared in a subdued blazer with Patricia 2 steps behind her as usual. I sat beside Daniel and kept my expression neutral while Sophia's attorney made the case that the prenuptial agreement should be considered invalid because it had been signed under duress, specifically under pressure from my father and without adequate independent legal counsel. Daniel was quiet and methodical in a way that I found genuinely admirable. He submitted the documentation showing that Sophia had been represented by her own attorney at signing. He submitted the initialed pages. He submitted the email exchange in which her attorney at the time had confirmed her client's voluntary agreement. He submitted the timeline showing that signing had taken place 12 days before the wedding. Not 48 hours before, not the morning of, but nearly 2 weeks prior, with adequate time to reconsider. He then submitted, with the court's permission, a collection of Sophia's own social media posts, documenting the relationship she had been conducting over the preceding 7 months, including the dates, including a photograph that had been posted and then deleted, but not before it had been screenshotted by 3 separate people who had been kind enough to forward it. The man in the photograph was someone I had met at a company holiday party. He had shaken my hand and told me I had a great wife. The judge reviewed everything in a silence that lasted long enough to be meaningful. She then ruled that the prenuptial agreement was valid and binding. The settlement would proceed according to its terms. Sophia would receive what the document specified, nothing more. Patricia stood up from her seat in the gallery and said something that the judge interrupted before it became a full sentence. Patricia sat back down. Outside the courthouse, Sophia stood on the steps with her hands in the pockets of her blazer and didn't look at me directly. Patricia was beside her, vibrating with a particular kind of outrage that had nowhere useful to go. Patricia said, "You planned this. You always planned this. You kept that document like a weapon." I said, "It's a legal contract that we both signed freely." "That's all it is," she said. "You drove her to this. You were never present, never emotionally available, always wrapped up in your work and your money and your image. She needed more than you were ever willing to give." I said, "Patricia, I know you believe that. I hope it brings you comfort." She looked like she wanted to say something sharp and couldn't land on the right word. Sophia turned away and walked toward the parking structure without looking back. Patricia followed after another moment, shooting me a look that I had come to understand was her version of a closing argument. I stood on the steps in the November gray and let it all settle. That wasn't the end of things, of course. Things rarely end cleanly. Over the following months, Sophia called me twice asking for money beyond the settlement terms. The first time, she said the settlement amount was insufficient given the cost of living adjustments she hadn't anticipated. I told her the settlement was binding, and she should speak to her attorney. The second time she called at 10 in the evening, and her voice had a different quality, less rehearsed, more raw, and she said she was struggling. She said she hadn't anticipated how things would land. She said the person she'd been seeing had ended things 2 months after the divorce was finalized, and that she was living in an apartment that felt too small, and that Patricia's constant presence was suffocating her rather than helping her. I listened. I let her talk for a few minutes. Then I said, "I'm sorry you're going through a hard time, Sophia. I genuinely mean that, but I can't be the person you call." She said, "I know. I didn't think it would feel like this." I said, "I know." She said, "I thought I knew what I wanted." I said, "I hope you figure it out." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How's Tyler?" I said, "He's good. He's doing well in school. He made the junior varsity basketball team." She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite something else. She said, "That's really good. Tell him I called." I said I would. I said goodnight and I hung up and stood in my kitchen for a while. I had meant what I said. I was sorry she was struggling. The anger had mostly drained out of me by that point. Not all at once, not gracefully, but gradually, the way water finds its level. What was left underneath wasn't quite peace and wasn't quite indifference. It was something more honest than either of those things. It was the recognition that I had loved her for a long time, and that the version of her I had loved had been real, and that people contain more than one version of themselves, and that some versions are capable of things that others aren't. She had stood in our backyard on my birthday, in front of everyone who knew us, and detonated 14 years like it was a stage effect. She had done it publicly, deliberately, with her mother's approval and her lover's waiting and no apparent consideration for our son or for the accumulated weight of everything we had built. That was a true thing. It was also true that somewhere inside the woman who had done that was the same woman who had cried at Tyler's first steps and kept every card I had ever given her, and once driven 2 hours in the snowstorm because I had a fever and couldn't get home on my own. I didn't know what to do with the whole of that. I suspected I wasn't supposed to know. I suspected that was just what a marriage ending actually felt like. Under all the legal paperwork and righteous anger and public narratives, just that particular unresolvable weight of having known someone completely, and then not knowing them at all. Tyler came home from practice that evening and dropped his bag by the door and went straight for the refrigerator. He said, "Good day?" I said, "Decent day." "You?" He said, "Coach said I have a real shot at varsity next year if I keep working on my left hand." He said it like he was trying not to care too much about it. I said, "That's excellent. That's genuinely excellent, bud." He pulled out leftovers and stood at the counter eating them cold without apparent concern, the way teenagers do. And I sat at the kitchen table and watched him and thought that this ordinary, undramatic, lukewarm, leftover Tuesday was something I was profoundly grateful for. Patricia eventually stopped posting. I don't know if it was exhaustion or a lack of audience response or something Sophia said to her. The mutual acquaintances who had been carefully neutral began to drift back toward normal contact, the way people do when a story loses its heat. A few of them apologized to me, not quite directly. They said things like, "I'm glad things are settling down," which is the social equivalent of an apology, and I accepted it as such. About 8 months after the divorce was finalized, Daniel sent me a short email with the subject line, "Thought you should know." Sophia's attorney had filed a motion challenging the prenuptial agreement for a second time, on different grounds, citing an obscure procedural argument about the timing of a required disclosure form. Daniel's response took 11 days and was apparently thorough enough that no further motions were filed. I read the email, replied with a thank you, and went to make coffee. I didn't feel angry. I felt, more than anything, a kind of tired clarity. She was going to keep trying. Patricia was probably going to keep advising her to try. That was their pattern, and patterns don't dissolve just because the circumstances change. I could not control that. What I could control was how much of my interior life I allowed it to occupy. The answer I had settled on was, not much. Tyler turned 17 in March. We drove 2 hours to watch a college basketball game, just the two of us, and ate stadium food that was objectively terrible and stayed until the final buzzer, even though the home team lost by 19 points. On the drive back, he was quiet for a while in the particular way that sometimes means something and sometimes means nothing. Then he said, "Dad, do you think Mom made the right choice?" I thought about it for a real moment, not a reflexive one. I said, "I think your mother made the choice she believed was right for her at the time. I think choices like that have consequences that are hard to see clearly until later." He said, "Do you think she knew what the consequences would be?" I said, "I don't think so. I think she was very focused on one thing and not seeing around it." He was quiet again. Then he said, "I'm not mad at her. I don't understand it." I said, "You don't have to understand it. You just have to figure out how to have a relationship with her that doesn't cost you too much." He said, "Did you figure that out? With her?" I said, "I'm still working on it." He looked out the window at the highway lights going past. He said, "At least you're honest about it." I said, "I try to be." He said, "Okay, Dad, that's all I'm asking for." I moved through the next year with a kind of deliberate ordinariness that I came to genuinely value. I worked, I cooked dinner most nights. I watched Tyler play basketball. I took a long weekend in September with a couple of old friends and slept well and didn't think about Sophia once for an entire Saturday, which felt like an accomplishment. I started running again, something I'd let go of years earlier when the business was demanding too much of me. I ran badly and slowly and found the whole thing deeply satisfying. I was not without regret. I knew I had worked too much. I knew there had been years when I was present in the house but not present in the marriage. There's a difference, and I had not always been honest with myself about it. I had told myself I was providing, building something, giving us security, and all of that was true. But it was also true that I had sometimes used those things as reasons, not to show up in the harder and less transactional ways. I thought about that. I sat with it. I didn't perform public contrition about it, but I held it privately and tried to understand what it was trying to tell me about the kind of person I wanted to be going forward. That's the difference between accountability and punishment. One is useful. The other is just another way to be stuck. A mutual friend told me last spring that Sophia had moved to another city and was, by most accounts, doing better. That she was working in a new industry and living with a roommate and seemed, in the friend's careful phrasing, more settled than she'd been in a while. I was glad to hear it. I meant that, without irony or performance. I wanted her to be okay. I wanted Tyler to be able to have a relationship with his mother that didn't require him to manage her pain. Patricia, the friend said, was not speaking to Sophia at the moment, for reasons that weren't entirely clear. I received this information and set it aside without commentary. Some things don't require a response. I am not the villain of this story, though I understand why I played the role in certain tellings of it. I held a legal document and used it exactly as legal documents are designed to be used. I refused to rescue someone from consequences that were entirely of her own making. I moved my son into a stable home when he needed one and didn't make him feel guilty about it. None of that is heroic. It's just what you do when you've decided to stop participating in a narrative that requires you to be the bad guy in order for someone else to be the victim. Sophia wanted freedom. She got it, fully and completely, on a Tuesday afternoon in a courthouse with her mother behind her and a valid prenuptial agreement on the table. That's not a punishment. That's just the unedited version of what she asked for. Some nights I still sit on the back porch of my apartment and think about the way the party looked from inside the house when I walked away. String lights, white roses, the sound of a crowd not quite knowing what to do with what they'd just witnessed. I think about Tyler's sound, the one that wasn't quite a word. I think about how long I stood in that home office, holding a phone before I made the call. I think about all the small moments in a long marriage that you don't know are the last of something until they're already behind you. Then I go inside. I lock the door. I sleep reasonably well. That's enough.